American philosopher and psychologist William James is famous for, among other things, declaring the fact that people have a tendency to be tough-minded or tender-minded. You sometimes hear that called tough-minded or tender-hearted. I think the most amazing thing about this symposium to date is that all of the speakers seem to exhibit the tough-minded quality of knowing how to think and looking reality in the eye, but they have also exhibited what I like to call the tender-hearted aspect. I'm no exception. I'm a physical scientist, and yet there were some presentations made this morning which I think emphasized that aspect a bit more by people who can be just as tough-minded as I. And I say without embarrassment or any kind of apology that I had a few tears in my eyes. It was really quite touching what some of these people said. This afternoon, we've heard some excellent talks on many of the legal aspects, which do require a very analytical approach. And if you don't pay attention to it, you might find yourself in hot water if you come to the point where you need this kind of service. So we're going to continue in that spirit by two excellent speakers, both of whom I am convinced know how to be tough-minded and tender-hearted, and I shall now introduce the first. Our first speaker is going to be Janis Landis, who is currently the president of Final Exit. I think many of you now know about Final Exit. It's already been discussed. And it's an organization that I think is doing something very essential. I understand, I don't want to call it an organization that's split off from, it does similar things, but formerly I believe Compassionate Choices may have, the Hemlock Society, okay, which I rather imagine isn't doing too well right now. Okay, fine, I don't want to give the speakers talk. But the situation has evolved to the point where the Final Exit Society, I think, will offer us, and I won't do it, some excellent suggestions on how to take a few steps beyond what has been done in Oregon, and I think we're all happy that it has been done. So with no further ado, let me introduce our speaker. Title of her talk, just a moment, I have to tell them who you are. You know, that's de rigueur when you do this sort of thing. Why does the concept of suicide cause such outrage? And now I have to convince them that you really know what you're talking about, and we all know that you do. Janice is, as indicated, the president-elect of the Final Exit Network called FAN. FAN is the only American organization that organizes for the right of competent adults suffering from incurable, unbearable medical conditions to make their own end-of-life decisions. She was initially drawn to this work because of her philosophical convictions about a meaningful life. But the decision of several states to prosecute FAN, oh, that's interesting, and very complimentary, I might add, in violation of its members' Fifth Amendment rights, caused her to focus her energies into this organization. Janice is a lifelong resident of New York City, a proud graduate of the City College of New York, served on the City College Fund Board. Holds a master's degree in political science from this great Columbia University, and her husband, of 45 years, retired as chair of political science at Hofstra University, where I once gave an interesting talk. That's a neat place, too. They have 2 married children and are expecting their first grandchild in June. Please give a warm welcome to Janis Landis.
All right. Well, it is certainly true that as a New Yorker, can you hear me okay? I've never met an argument I didn't like. So being here is really like, I don't know, like a meth head in a lab producing this stuff, because I found so many things to get mad about. But I want to talk specifically, of course, about the right to die. We all have a right to die because we all are going to do so, but the means and the ways. And I want to talk first about Robin Williams. When Robin Williams killed himself, committed suicide, There was tremendous shock and dismay because he was such an upbeat person. And a lot of people questioned his right to do that. And I'm interested first in asking your opinion, just by a show of hands. Good decision, bad decision that he made? What were your feelings? Good? Bad? I'll ask you a second question. The reaction?
My answer would be, I need to know more.
Okay. All right, but everybody responded with what they saw in the paper. Your position may have evolved over time. I want to read to you his daughter's reaction and get your opinion on that. Now remember, this man had Parkinson's. Not only did he have Parkinson's, but he had a dire side effect of Parkinson's, horrible, frightening hallucinations that could not be stopped. They would only get worse in time, and they were terrified. She wrote, I never understood how he could be loved so deeply without finding it in his heart to stay. How many agree with that? How many disagree with that? Thank you. This is one of the main reasons why we exist as FEN, because people seem to have things the wrong way around. If somebody is suffering, the fact that you love them does not actually ease their pain. And it's not a matter of how much you love them that they should have a guilt trip. It's, do you love them enough to put their need before yours? So there is a war in this country, and this family exemplifies it. The war is often within the family itself. And the person who is ill cannot talk about their feelings because they're told they're going to be fine. And there is a war in this country against bodily autonomy, because we do not seem to feel that although we can own as many cars as we please and own as many houses as we please, and we're encouraged to purchase and to own and to purchase and to own, we do not have a purchase tag for our bodies. And we have not as much autonomy as people think we do. And there is a war at the government level against it. We referred to some of our prosecutions, and I'm going to talk about that more. But first, I want to describe to you a recent battlefield in this war against bodily autonomy. And this is a true story. And the battle took place in California a few years ago, in a quiet street in a quiet town at dawn, when agents in full SWAT mode from 5 federal agencies and a few state agencies assembled outside the house of a suspect, broke into the house for maximum terror, dragged the suspect out of bed, seized the evidence, carted off the person to jail. Typical story, except that the woman was 90 years old. The evidence seized was her sewing machine, and the contraband were helium bags that she made, used by people who have decided to end their life. Why did she do it? Her motivation? Well, she didn't do it to make money. She did it because her husband had died of colon cancer, and she sat by his bed in the hospital hearing him say, home, home, home. And she was not allowed to take him home. He was not allowed to go home, because somehow their respective wishes over his bodily autonomy were not up to them, even though he was dying. That's an extraordinary thing. Now, why did these 5 agencies do this? Presumably, they're honorable people doing what they think is important. I worked for the federal government. I'm a big believer in the federal government and its powers to do good and to right inequalities and to provide justice. They did it because the idea of being responsible for your own life is threatening to the entire structure upon which society is built. Because the government says to us, lower your expectations of a good life and a good death to what we decide they are. And I say, raise your expectations to what we demand, not the other way around. The federal government has a war against bodily autonomy, and it's illustrated in their reaction to pain medication. They've recently waged war against pain medication because it's the low-hanging fruit in their pathetic war against drugs, which they haven't scratched the surface of, but prescriptions are easy to go by. And so veterans who served honorably in Afghanistan and Iraq have been taken off their pain medications with no program for alternative pain treatment. As one of them said, the VA has treated us like lepers. No alternatives for them. Sure, addiction is a problem, and it needs to be treated, but we don't solve the problem that way, and we don't solve the problem by leaving people in pain in nursing homes and in hospitals. It used to be, before the 1950s, that 85% of Americans died at home. Now, 85% die in a medical facility. 85% of Americans used to die in a natural setting, dying a natural death. What happened to us? Where did we go wrong? Well, of course, part of it is this sudden religious fervor that led to the talking about death panels, that if a doctor wants to talk to you about your life and choices, that's a death panel. That's the same as putting a bullet in your head. Whatever happened to informed consent? Whatever happened to a patient knowing all their options? We used to say in personnel to people, there was a rule that if you were going to fire somebody, you could tell them, well, you can quit if you prefer. And the manual used to say, it is perfectly legal to tell somebody, if we're going to fire you, if you don't want to be fired, you have to quit. The fact that both choices are inherently unpleasant doesn't make them illegal. Yes, you have two unpleasant choices, treatment that is horrible or death, but death may be the better of the two alternatives. It is against this kind of background of a lack of understanding of a person's rights that Derek Humphrey started the whole Right to Die movement. And I'm not going to talk about that movement in any detail. This is really not my purpose here, but Derek Humphrey started the Hemlock Society when his wife was dying and begged for his assistance because of the pain, and he did assist her. That was in England. He came here, started the whole movement, revolutionized the entire idea of end-of-life rights. And I'm very proud to say that of the various organizations that exist, Derek Humphrey has chosen to stay with the Final Exit Network because we most closely align with his philosophy, which is the right of a competent adult facing a difficult decision to make their own choice. There were two other organizations that used to be Hemlock. Hemlock drank its own Hemlock cup and died. Two organizations followed, Compassion and Choices and us. There's a third group, Death with Dignity. They originally started the process in Oregon, and they continue to press for legislative change. Compassion and Choices and Death with Dignity are both basically lobbying groups, and basically, both of them only talk about terminally ill as defined by 6 months left. Every doctor will tell you there is no meaning to that sentence. Nothing happens, a little tag doesn't pop up, expired by date. Nor does it have any meaning in terms of suffering. There are people who know they're terminally ill, 6 months they're going to die, but in the meanwhile their pain is well controlled and they're perfectly okay and they have a good quality of life. There are people, a year from death who are suffering terribly. This is the most abstract of ideas. That said, I give Compassion and Choice tremendous credit for bringing the Brittany Maynard case to light. And it really galvanized the discussion. And 15 states are discussing legislation. And guess what? We'll be lucky if a couple of them pass. In this golden moment, with the entire public attention focused on it, they're not optimistic. Connecticut's already withdrawn its bill. Because the opposition is more determined and focused than are other people for whom it's just one of many issues. But the opposition is relentless at the legislature. And by the way, the politics of the situation is in itself very interesting. For fear that any change in the Oregon law, which is used as a model, would set off a wave of slippery slope discussions, there was a legislator in Oregon who just introduced a bill to extend the 6 months to 1 year, and he was told by Compassion and Choice and Dignity with Death to withdraw that measure. There is a refusal to go beyond the 6 months. New York State, I spoke to the person who's lobbying for the change, and he told me the same thing. They will not accept anything except the Oregon 6-month standard. So 10 years after Oregon, we haven't made a lot of progress. When you look at how gay rights have moved, our pace is glacial, glacial. And that is why we have a mission at Finn. Even if you meet the criteria for terminal illness, in most states, as with Brittany Maynard, you have to move away from your home. You have to move to a state where it's legal. And if you're not meeting the definition of 6 months, they can't help you at all. Finn is different. We recognize that some of the worst situations are neurological. In Oregon, 90% of the people who apply are cancer patients because very few other people can meet the 6-month standard and still be physically and mentally capable of taking the medication. But if you have ALS, you can't wait for 6 months because you won't be physically capable of swallowing when you're 6 months from there. And if you have Alzheimer's, you will never be physically or mentally competent when you are within that. And so for those people, FEN is the only organization in the United States that can provide any information on how to achieve a painless death. And I might add that we are the only organization that recommends this particular method. Compassion and Choice and Death with Dignity, of course, if you have the physician's prescription, you get a cocktail and you can drink, and that's certainly the easiest of the ways. But for other people, the only alternative that Compassion and Choices and Death with Dignity gives you is one of these two things. Find some pills on your own, stockpile them, and take them. Well, first of all, you know that controlled medicine is very carefully watched and calibrated. If you're that sick, you have a caretaker, be it family or a professional. They're not going to let you hide them under the mattress. But let's say you manage to do it. Do you know what you have? Do you know what the effects are? Do you know if you will be able to keep it down without throwing it right back up? And do you know how long it will take? It could take hours. How many people in that situation are left alone for hours while they slumber off to sleep? It's not going to happen. The other method is voluntary stopping of eating and drinking. Let me talk about that for a minute. People say that as if that's an easy thing to do, and many people will tell you it is. It is only easy for people who are terminally ill and whose bodies are shutting down. That is nature's way of gently transitioning you to death. Those people do not have an appetite. And yet, perversely, those are the very people we insist on feeding. We hook them up to a tube when their body has told us. If you want to talk about defying God's will, well, that would appear to be defying it. Presumably, that body is shutting down in accordance with God's plan for them, and yet they subvert it. Now, for a healthy person, and I say healthy heart-wise, lung-wise, you may have a terrible disease, but your heart and lungs, particularly if you have Alzheimer's, for example, they may be in great shape. In which case, it's pretty much like my saying, you over there, as of this moment, don't eat or drink anything. Eventually you'll die. It doesn't really sound very appealing, does it? And by the way, you can't get any hospice worker to help you because you're not within 6 months of death. So you will die horribly. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. When you are thirsty and you can't have anything, it's torture. And your family will sit there and have to ignore the most fundamental desire of a human being, which is to nurture a loved one. To watch you thirst and not intervene is a superhuman effort and a exquisite torture. So to cavalierly say this to me is to exhibit such a obsessive need to stick to this 6-month law that you have just obscured all the other facts around it. I'm going to give you 2 actual cases to show you what FEN does. One of them is somebody who has applied to our program, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, how we do that. He applied to a program because he has a degenerative disease, a very obscure one, of the cerebellum. Over the course of 7 years, 10 years, it will inch by inch take away every ability he has. His balance is going, his speech is going, every day is a deficit. Just a tiny whittling away at a giant tree, slice by slice by slice. One day he may wake up unable to do what he needs to do to end his life. And how does he know this so clearly? Because it's a hereditary condition. And as a young man, he watched his mother die over 10 years of this disease. So he has no illusions, and there is no cure, and it's not going to end happily for him. He doesn't have another option. There isn't a scientist madly at work in the lab about to come up with a cure for this obscure disease. So he is enrolled with us, and it has given him tremendous peace of mind. He knows he will have to die sooner than he would otherwise choose. If he could have his way, and if we could have our way, he would write his instructions very clearly as to when he wants to die, and we would be able to lift the cup and help him drink it or put some injection into his arm. But that's murder, and that's not even anything vaguely being talked about in this country. Euthanasia isn't anywhere in the cards, so we can't help him with that. So he's going to have to choose a moment in time when he feels the balance start to shift. He might want to live for another 6 months, but he cannot take the chance because he might lose the ability tomorrow. Every day is a roll of the dice for him. But at least he knows he will have a choice, and he will take that choice. I'll read to you a letter from somebody else, one of our other members, who has already died. And this is the letter, an excerpt from that letter. This is a person who was diagnosed with Parkinson's, which, of course, is also what Robin Williams had. She wrote a very long and moving letter about how her life was affected by it, every aspect of her life. And this is what she said in one paragraph. What I have is incurable, progressive, and degenerative. It will make me into a tremoring, twisted, drooling, demented, diapered mess in a wheelchair. I am terrified. I feel sick and tired almost all the time. And I know that it is only going to get worse. I can think of nothing else. The words incurable, progressive, and degenerative are with me every moment of the day. I cannot live like this. and I believe that those who love me would not want me to. The act is not the result of depression. It is the result of the reality of my condition. I wish that society would grow up enough to allow people the kind and dignified death we're permitted to give to our pets. I'd like to underscore that sentence. It is not the reality of being depressed that's the problem. The depression reflects reality. There are people, obviously with biochemical imbalances, who can be treated successfully for depression. But when someone's lost their entire family in a fire, do we condescendingly say to them, oh, well, you're just depressed? They are legitimately depressed and legitimately grieving, and we should not deny them that human feeling. This woman has a rational reason to be depressed, and quite frankly, I think she was crazy if she wasn't depressed. So what does it mean to say, oh, she's just depressed? She is depressed, but it's a realistic depression. It's a rational depression brought on by facts that she cannot change and is willing to look squarely at. This woman was assigned one of our exit guides. I'll talk a little bit more about what they do, but the exit guide sits at the side of the person, if they ask, when they die, to be there with them. The exit guide described the interaction this way about the individual. She asked plenty of questions and showed determination to move ahead quickly. She felt very safe and confident in her decision. She fully understood the significance of what she had determined to do. Her voice in that last phone call, that was when they were setting up the date, sounded happier and more at peace than I had heard in the previous months. Her voice, her words remind us all of why it is important that we do this work. This woman made her choice, and for the first time in years, the burden lifted from her shoulder. She said, I'm ready. I am ready to die. I am comfortable with my decision. That is an incredible, incredible thing to be able to offer someone. The solace of a peaceful, dignified death on their terms. We don't choose to die. That's a misnomer. This woman, just like Brittany Maynard, would far prefer to live. That was not the choice in front of her. The choice was to become this twisted, demented, pain-racked person whose family would watch her suffer every day. That was the choice. It wasn't a choice to die. FEN is the only organization that deals with individuals like this. And our roots go back, as I said, to Hemlock, but specifically to a Hemlock member who herself found no humane way to end her suffering because there was no physician-assisted dying, there was no alternative. She ultimately shot herself. But she left money to initiate a program, which I think was called Caring Friends in those days. And then when Hemlock ended, Compassion & Choices took the money and the lobbying, and a small, and I mean a small group of volunteers, determined to carry on the legacy of that woman through the Final Exit Network. This is what we do. We don't lobby. We don't hold big meetings. We don't have an office. Almost everyone on our staff is a volunteer. We have several administrative people who are paid, they're part-time workers. But every individual who takes the calls, who talks to these individuals, who sits by their side when they die, is a volunteer. And we charge nothing to anyone. They do have to become a member, and that's $50. We would waive that if they couldn't pay. We'd charge them $1. The membership is to signify their agreement with our principles. There is no other charge, because every bit of money we get goes to the purpose of alleviating the suffering of individuals who have nowhere else to turn. We don't believe in the nobility of suffering. We don't believe that you should offer it up to Jesus. And I will make a very irreverent comment here, and I doubt I'll offend anyone in this group, but I apologize if I do. I sometimes say to people who disagree with us, I said, well, how about if they offered up to Jesus for 3 days, because that's as long as he spent before he asked to be relieved of his pain. So how about we set that up as a rule? 3 days and you have a right to die. How's that? Seems fair to me. I don't understand why we think that pain is good. And yet, it is a motif in every single religion, the nobility of suffering. Why? Because if we didn't say that, who the heck would accept it? We have to pretend that there's some value to it. And by the way, it is true, of course, in the Catholic religion, and in the Protestant religion, Islam, Hindus. Most people say that pain is part of the wheel of life, part of the way you get your reward for the next life. And I might add, I was very stunned to discover that the Dalai Lama agrees with that principle. He does not believe a person in pain has a right to end their life. And his reason is very close to the Catholic theology. Because in those months of pain, you may achieve enlightenment and move on to a higher incarnation. So this is a universal, strikingly universal. So if the logic of ending your life, if you're not stopped by religion, what is the opposition to this? Why do prosecutors feel so strongly that 3 states prosecuted the Final Exit Network? Georgia, because a man decided to end his life and his ex-wife decided she didn't like that he did it. And so she complained to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. They arrested our volunteers. They seized all our records. They seized all our assets. Ultimately, we were vindicated by the Georgia Supreme Court, which itself, and it's not exactly a bastion of liberal thinking, unanimously ruled that our First Amendment rights had been violated. And they ended the entire case because Georgia said we had no right to talk about suicide. That's what they were saying. That's clearly a First Amendment right. We do not encourage suicide. We do not advocate for suicide. We don't even help anyone make the pros and cons. That's for an adult, competent adult. All we tell them is if they meet our criteria, we will tell them how a process can be done. They must do it. We are not allowed to do it. What I privately would like to be able to do is an entirely different story. We stay within the law. Georgia, not content with stealing all our records, taking all our money, went through those records and notified the district attorneys of every state of the name of any individual had contacted us. And they actually had law enforcement people knocking at doors saying, hello, I understand you once considered suicide. Unbelievable. Arizona decided this looked like so much fun. They decided to prosecute some of our folks too. And the jury in Arizona, again, not a liberal state, told the district attorney what they thought of that by returning a not guilty verdict. And so Minnesota, how many years? 5 years after the death there? 5 years after the death, some district attorney has now decided to prosecute us for a case of a voluntary suicide there as well. Because for some reason, they just can't let go of this. This notion of people having autonomy seems to be intolerable to individuals. I have no problem with people who feel that in God we trust. I have a big problem with saying in politically motivated district attorneys pretending to be God, I trust. So how did they explain this? Well, of course, one big thing is the disabled community. They have whipped up the not dead yet people into a frenzy so that they believe that our agenda is to literally kill them. The fact is that they wouldn't even qualify under our own conditions if they came to us, because most of them are functional people, perhaps in a wheelchair, perhaps other impediments, but they're functioning people. Nobody is interested in having them end their life. They came to one of our meetings. They blocked the doors to the hotel. They blocked the elevators. They would have caused, if there was a fire, it was the handicapped people in that hotel who could not have gotten out. Talk about an irony. So where are we now? Surprisingly, not very far. The Supreme Court has ruled that there is no constitutional right to die, right to physician-assisted death, which means that's why it's in the states. Now, this is a stunning comparison to Canada, which just a month or two ago, Supreme Court unanimously declared that an individual has a right to physician assistance, and it doesn't have to be a terminal disease. It can be suffering such that cannot be remedied and causes a complete deterioration of the quality of life. And they have 1 year to implement it. So Canada went from here to there, and we're still begging a few states for the 6-month rule. And that's why Fenn has very little interest in the lobbying effort. It's not working. It's not getting us where we need to go. And even if they got it, it's much too little for the effort that you go through. It simply doesn't do enough for the people who need it. And at that, as I said, most of the states aren't even going to pass it, which is quite extraordinary to me. So if somebody comes to us, despite what you may hear, we don't say, well, you look a little down today. Would you like a helium bag to put over your head? No. They have to submit medical evidence. They have to show what their condition is. We have to meet with them at their home, talk to them. It's an extensive process. And by the way, we do meet with the family and encourage the individual to talk to their family so that their family is on board with what they're going to do. And we had a case of a woman with multiple sclerosis, was deteriorated very badly. And her brother was her nearest relative, and he lived in another state. And he was adamant she should not do this. And after discussion, she invited him to come stay with her for a few days. And when he saw the lack of any quality of life, he said, I will sit by your side while you do this. Now, in her case, she was able to get medication. We were not involved in that. And not involved in getting the medication. We did have an exit guide present. And it was really, if it can come anywhere close to those Hollywood death scenes, this did. She was home. Her brother was there. She was advised by her exit guide to take one of the pills first because it's kind of bitter and that she would kind of get used to it. And she kind of like, oh, it was bitter. And she said, seriously, she said, well, that's really bitter, but I'm going to take them all if it kills me. And then there was just silence. And then she burst out laughing. And she took the rest of them. And her brother sat there by her side. And she died almost giggling over that joke, rather than hooked up to tubes in hideous pain. And that's irrational? That's an irrational act? I don't get it. We hear about the slippery slope. This country must be built on a ski mountain. Because everything we go to do, we're told about the slippery slope. Well, folks, 10 years have gone by since Oregon. There is no slippery slope. 100 or so people a year, all of them with health care. It's not a matter of they didn't have insurance. They're educated, they're informed, they have medical care, they don't want to go on. 100 people, 30% of whom never even take it because either they die of natural causes or knowing that they can exit is sufficient for them. It gives them the peace of mind to go on day after day, and that's what they're looking for. So if it's not the slippery slope, what is it? Well, we're often told people will have no choice because there won't be any other options for them. Wrong. Studies have shown that once Oregon had physician-assisted dying, the quality of hospice care improved markedly. No surprise. No surprise. Who would choose it if it was horrible, if they had a better alternative? And a more striking example is the Netherlands. The Netherlands has by far the most liberal laws, which include euthanasia. They're way out there compared to us. But they recently opened a care facility for people with Alzheimer's that is, to my knowledge, without parallel anywhere. It's a self-contained village so that people are free to wander around because they can't go anywhere outside it, but it looks like a town. It has a cafe, it has a grocery store. All patients wear regular clothes. The medical staff wears regular clothes. Everything these patients say is treated as normal. They have no sense of there being a problem. And this is in the facility, this is in the country with the most liberal laws. Not surprising. If it was your relative and you could have them die gently, or they could sit for 10 years in dirty diapers in a dank hallway of a nursing home, what would you choose? I don't think there'd be any surprise. Doctors say, I don't want to be involved in this. And my answer, I don't want you involved either. I don't think they should be in the business, but I don't know why they need to be. The prescription is pretty standard. I say, tell a doctor to fill out a form certifying that you are terminal, or whatever it is. Fill out the form. That's reasonable. Once you filled out the form, let the state dispense the cocktail of drugs. I don't need him. He's not adding any medical knowledge. He's giving a prognosis of my case. That's all. He doesn't have to write the prescription. Take him out of it completely. But at the same time, stop having a medical system that rewards you for needless treatment. If you're serious about it, you don't want to be involved, then don't tell people who are dying that they should keep on with their chemo because there's a whole new experimental drug. We have seen that people on palliative care do better and have a better quality of life than the ones who chase an elusive experimental drug that does not work but causes nothing but pain in those last months when they could be having a good life. So where do you come into this? The clergy are not going to help us on this. This is not an issue like civil rights that the clergy are going to get behind. It's folks like you. And I think a good place to start the discussion is to be open about rational suicide and not cover it up. I'd like you to consider the following. How many times do you read in an obituary, so-and-so died after a valiant struggle against cancer? They don't write, so-and-so died after years of torture, put family through a ringer, and died hooked up to tubes, never having had a chance to have the conversation about his last wishes. How about an alternative scenario in which the obituary says, having realized that he was terminal, he requested appropriate palliative care so he could enjoy the time that he was left, used the money to take his whole family to Disney World, had a blowout vacation, picked a date for the family to be at his bedside, had a glass of champagne, told them that he loved them, and closed his eyes. We should write that. We should set up rituals and ceremonies and applaud the wisdom of people who do that instead of making a secret out of it, making it shameful, as if these people had done something wrong when they had nothing to apologize for. So I say if there's a role for atheists, this is tailor-made for it. Take the cause and celebrate it. Make rituals for people to celebrate the end of life rather than the focus on his reward is yet to come. I think that kind of message has, not only is it not selfish, but I think the refusal to accept a substandard life, to stand up and say no, is the most selfless act, because it tells our society, we are worth more than this, and you either rise to our expectations or we will take it into our own hands to run our own life. And that should be true throughout our life. We have the autonomy to say, no, I'm not waiting for the afterlife. I want what I want. I want a good life. I'm entitled to a good life. And I want a good death. And if you won't give it to me, I'll take it.
Janice, that was wonderful. I love your passion. No, that is what we need. We all know David Hume said, reason is the slave of the passion, but sometimes you need the passion to implement the reason. So you've given us both. Thank you so much.